Hello, thank you all of you for joining us today. For those of you who don't know me, my name's Holly and I'm Education Lead at Reboot the Future. Reboot the Future is a small foundation co-founded by our chair, Kim Pullman, in 2018, with a vision of a compassionate and sustainable world powered by conversation and connection. The principle underpinning our work is a modern day version of the golden rule, which is to treat others and the planet as you would wish to be treated. We're delighted that you could join us for this conversation about how we can all reboot the future of food and for the screening of one of our new short films. We know that it's a tough time for teachers and it's a particularly busy and intense week as you prepare for the return to in-person learning on Monday. So thank you all so much for joining us for the next 45 minutes. I'd also like to thank the Fairtrade Foundation for welcoming us as part of their fantastic Choose the World You Want festival. It's been a great 2 weeks and such a fun festival to be part of. And thanks too to the Fairtrade Foundation's CEO, Mike Gidney, for joining us here today. And on that note, I'd like to introduce him and the rest of our speakers who are here. So Mike Gidney has worked in international development for 30 years, with a particular focus on fighting poverty through trade. He joined the Fairtrade Foundation in 2009 as Deputy Executive Director before becoming Chief Executive in 2012. We're also joined today by Jonathon Porritt, co-founder of Forum for the Future, a veteran campaigner and eminent writer, broadcaster and commentator on sustainable development. In January 2000, he received a CBE for services to environmental protection. We've also got Becky Birchall. Becky specialises in hopeism, sharing stories of hope through the arts to inspire positive change in addressing our environmental and climate crisis. Becky is the founder of Change Festival, a theatre and film producer, a fellow for the Centre for the Understanding of Sustainable Prosperity, University of Surrey, and is leading the 50-year regenerative vision for her rural Dorset community. Sophie Austin is a theatre and film director based in London. She is creative director at SHH Productions, a female-led film production company, and creative associate at international arts organisation Dash Arts. Sophie's work is currently focused on telling essential and hope-filled stories that bond us to the environment and allow us to embrace our connections to the natural world. And last but not least, we have Anthony Bennett, who is CEO for Reboot the Future. After studying environmental art at Glasgow School of Art, his professional career has been across the environmental, cultural, and educational sectors. He believes that a sustainable world is only possible through the integration of these three specialisms, using the golden rule as a common lens. Thank you all of you for joining us here today. So, as many of you know, this April, we will be launching our latest campaign in education resources, How Will You Reboot the Future? This campaign is built around inspiring and empowering your students to do more to tackle the climate crisis. On April the 21st, we will be releasing a set of teaching resources for secondary school students to accompany 5 short films and a new book from Jonathon Porritt. This will lead into a creative competition launched later in the year for all age groups. The 5 films, collectively titled Rise Up, are each told from the perspective of a different young person who, over the next 5 years, each in their own way, helps to bring about a more compassionate and sustainable future. Discussion questions and activities paired with the book and films will help you to spark conversations about the role we can all play over the next 5 years. The video we're screening today is one of the 5 Rise Up films. And as it's the Fairtrade Festival, we've chosen Jamal's story to share with you, the story of food and the role it plays in rebooting the future. So, without further ado, I'm delighted to share the first ever screening of a Rise Up short film, Jamal's story. As it's a Zoom call and the internet loves to play games with us, we do have a contingency plan should the film not stream properly. My colleague Rebecca is going to share a link to the video in the chat. So if you need to mute me and play through the link instead, then go ahead and we can reconvene after. The film is about 7 minutes long. So fingers crossed it all goes to plan. And just a quick note, the sound doesn't start for the first 20 seconds, so please don't panic if it's silent until you see Jamal's name on screen. Okay, so here we are. This is Jamal's story. So I hope you all enjoyed that as I did. I love that film, and yeah, I just wanted to say thank you to everyone who's been involved in working on these films, and particularly to Becky and Sophie, who are sat here with us now, and also to our wonderful scriptwriter Beth as well. We're all very much looking forward to sharing the rest of the films when we launch the campaign on April 21st. So let's get this conversation started. My first question is to you, Jonathon. Your book, Rise Up to Reboot the Future, was the inspiration for these films. And in the book, you highlight food and farming as one of the 10 key areas that need to change over the next 5 years. Why do you think it's such a vital area of focus for building a sustainable future? You're on mute, Jonathon.
It is such a big part of everybody's future. And it's a part of our system that goes so badly wrong at the moment. I mean, I'm sure Mike will talk about this later from a Fairtrade and international perspective, but there are so many people who end up not getting what they need from the food system of which we're all a part, whether that's nutritionally or in terms of the access to food, in terms of the impact on the environment. It's just a really dysfunctional, badly performing system almost everywhere in the world. So for me, when we put together this idea about Rise Up and about how young people in particular are going to reshape the world, reboot the world so that it looks very different, it was critical to have the opportunity to think about that from a food perspective, where they live in their communities, not necessarily sort of the big picture, but just the difference that they can make locally with their friends. And the story behind this, of course, is the chronic injustice about food deserts. I mean, you can hardly believe the huge numbers of people here in the UK who live in parts of the towns and cities of the UK where there's no access to fresh produce at all, or if there is, it's incredibly difficult or more expensive or whatever it might be, and whose diets, therefore, are significantly deficient in terms of the basic nutrients that they need. For me, that whole story about food justice lies right at the heart of what we have to do now to make the system work differently. And I love the way this film captures that quietly without being too shouty about what needs to happen next. But for young people and the opportunity to be involved in shaping that differently, I think this is a very exciting part of it.
Yeah, that's great. Thank you, Jonathon. My next question then is to Becky. What drew you to get involved with this project, and why do you think it's important to be having these conversations now with young people, particularly when it comes to food?
Yeah. So I was drawn to this project because I think Jonathon's got some incredibly important insights about our current situation and what we can do to overcome it. And I also think the arts and culture sector has a really important role to play in helping to creatively explore and amplify these ideas and changes that people like Jonathon and the Fairtrade Foundation and many other organisations are promoting it, and we can help them reach those audiences in different and more creative ways. So by making these short films, we had a really great chance to speak to a huge audience of young people about some of the most fundamental issues of our time. And of course, food is absolutely at the heart of this. I mean, I think young people today are more aware than ever about their food choices and how these impact the environment, which has been seen through the huge rise in things like plant-based diets. But the mainstream conversation, I think, is also centred a lot around the type of food that people eat. And there's been a much less nuanced conversation around how food is grown, what chemicals are used, how it's processed, how it's travelled, and of course how nutritionally dense it is. So I think Jamal's film is wonderful because it invites us to think about food sovereignty, organic and local produce, home cooking, and how that impacts on our health, and as well as, of course, of showing us the simple pleasures of growing our own food. So, you know, a short film can say 1,000 words. So I really hope it helps young people understand that there are many factors involved in how healthy or environmentally friendly their food choices are. But Jamal's film's also a reminder that we all have different interests and skills, but that we each have our own role to play in creating a better future. So for young people wondering how they can make a difference, I hope this will, you know, inspire them to think about their food choices in much more depth, but also to show that jobs such as being a chef or any kind of grower can play a really important role in the future.
Yeah, that's such a good point. I think, so I come from a teaching background myself. I used to be a teacher, and I found that there seemed to be such a drive towards academia and to sort of forcing our young people through this exam system and onto university, and actually to encourage young people to actually, like you say, the food industry, from growing to cooking it, is kind of underrepresented in schools at the moment. So yeah, I think that's such a good point, that actually to show that as a really good example of a career that is not just rewarding, but also rewarding for the planet as well. So yeah. So my next question then is to you, Mike. So in this film, Jamal says it's important to know where our food is from. I have two questions for you, really. Do you agree, and why? And then how does the Fairtrade Foundation work to make global supply chains more transparent and apparent to the end user?
Great questions. Thanks, Holly. I mean, yes, of course, I'd absolutely agree that that kind of transparency and traceability is the right thing. But it's not just about stats, you know, it's not just about the indication of calories or ingredients, although that's really important. But you've got to go further back. I mean, I thought the film was brilliant, really energizing, and as Jonathon said, not too shouty, not too preachy, so you can get stuck in with it, which is fantastic. But Jamal said, you know, you need to eat more vegetables. And then he said, you need to meet more vegetables. And I thought that was brilliant, because that's kind of where we are with Fairtrade. To really understand all of this, you've got to go right back. And for us, you've got to put the people in there as well. So you've got to meet more vegetables for sure, but you've got to meet more producers, more farmers. And so, you know, Fairtrade is all about making that connection. And I mean, the reason for that, of course, is you know, talking about food poverty, talking about sustainability, about fairness. It all goes back to us as a community. And Fairtrade is really an initiative which is trying to make food work for all of us, you know, and to make the food market, the food trade, work in a way that works for us as people. You know, at the moment, the global commodity trade is still, you know, that kind of colonial construct where the product is more important than the person. You know, even now we all buy our bananas and we don't really know where they come from. We just buy a banana, and that's terrible, right? So we're trying to kind of make this connection right back to the farm. And that's because farmers in the global south produce 15% of the food that we buy every day in the UK. So it's materially important to us as consumers. But they're facing a triple whammy. You know, they're tackling the pandemic like we all are. They are struggling with chronic underfunding, exploitation and poverty that goes back years, as we all know. And now we're trying to expect them all to adapt to shifting weather patterns and the kind of climate crisis, which is hitting them really hard. It's impossible without bringing all of these things together. And that starts with going right through the supply chain and understanding what is happening on the ground with farmers, and then making that connection to consumers. And that's where you can start to get a virtuous circle. Jonathan's completely right. The food system is totally broken, but we can solve it if we have that kind of visibility.
Yeah, absolutely. That's, yeah, important. And I think, like you say, for so many of us, food and the producers behind our food are invisible. And it was interesting before the webinar started, Becky, you were talking about something that your child's been involved in with their school, about kind of drinking Fairtrade hot chocolate and sort of understanding where cocoa beans are from. And I think that's something that Fairtrade do so incredibly well, is to bring that visibility. Yeah, and it's something that in the film, you know, Jamal says, you know, grow your own vegetables, and that is one way of doing it. But like you say, it's not the only way either, to kind of have that awareness. So my next question now is directed to Sophie. Was it important to you, Sophie, to tell hopeful stories in these films? Why is that? And what hope do you think Jamal's story offers to today's young people?
It was essential to tell hopeful stories in these films. I think I didn't know there were any hopeful stories about the environment until I met Jonathon. And having worked with him for the last couple of years, what he has brought and what his ideas and facts and knowledge has brought to my life has been extraordinary. And so being able to share his thoughts and ideas and the facts that he's been producing in this book has been essential. But obviously we're living in doom-filled times, right? And it's really easy to tell a doom-filled story. And Hollywood has got a lot to answer for. The BBC has got a lot to answer for in the way that it perpetuates these doom-filled narratives. And as an artist, I absolutely believe that young people especially deserve hope-filled narratives, and there is hope, and we have to be at the forefront of giving that out. And that's why I was delighted to do this commission with Reboot. What does Jamal's story tell us? Well, it tells us about friendship at the first and foremost. It's about allyship, it's about working together, it's about doing something outside of your education system perhaps as well. And so knowing that you and your friends can do something and can affect others is really important. Yeah.
Thank you. Yeah, you're right. I love the friendship in this film and the way in which you can see Jamal not just finding his love of food for himself, but also sharing that with his friend and sharing his dad, and sort of you can see actually how hope grows and how important that is. So, yeah.
It's really important. And I just, just going back onto the idea of story as well, there's a lot to be said about a drama narrative and an imagined narrative rather than a fact-based documentary style story that we could have done. And I think that the Fairtrade do really well in terms of telling the stories of their growers and farmers. But I think there's got to be something about a collective imagination and imagining something different. And that's what these films really offer. You see 5 different perspectives and different stories. You might recognize yourself in one of them. It's about being able to see it and then believe that it can be possible.
Yeah, that's so true. So Anthony, I have a question for you now. What role does education play in creating a more just and sustainable world? And how do you see these films and the wider campaign helping to achieve this?
Well, in answer to the first question, I would say that in the last year, a lot of our big systems and processes have been stress tested, almost to the point of destruction. And 2 of the big systems that have really been tested very firmly are the education system and also our food systems as well. So what's been exposed is our intense vulnerability in both of these systems. And in a way, the overlap of those 2 systems, especially so, right? So we already assess children's progress and vulnerability by how many school meals, free school meals are allowed within the system. So that space where we start to think about how school children learn socialization is something that's common across both food and the classroom, right? So I think where there's systemic overlap between these 2, I think the idea that it's where we learn community, it's where we learn reciprocity, it's where we learn to have a sense of our mutual self-interest. It's also, we saw through Marcus Rashford's campaigning of the last year that it's a place for social justice as well. And also typically school meals are the one place in the day that children in poverty will receive a square meal. So there's great exposure to those big systems and processes. I mean, there's lots of ways in which classrooms and schoolrooms are laboratories of the future, and people can imbibe good practices going forward. But I think there's also a strong sense of it's where we learn our culture, the culture around food, the culture around learning. And I think this is one way that, in a sense, the kind of progressive environmental movement, which broadly speaking, I think probably everyone on this call would be part of, has to play catch up. Because in terms of the idea that politics is downriver of culture, and I think we need to make a much more emphatic cultural case for environmentalism. I think we need to show ourselves as having a good time, and I think we need to put those tools into the hands of young people, because in a sense, school students are they're the principal investors in the future, right? They've got more to lose, if you like. So I think the role of the films has been is about trying to catalyze that and trying to say that actually we need to win the kind of the emotive argument as much as we're winning the scientific argument as well. And also it needs to be part of a democratic process. And I think one of the great things that's common to both lockdown and to climate breakdown is this lack of agency, right? There's a lack of sense that we don't have the tools to deal with it. And I think the sense of disempowerment is quite prevalent, and it's also terribly dangerous. And I don't think you want a generation of school children feeling that they can't change things. So the idea of having small multiple films that tell small stories that people can get traction with, and also that kids can interject with and feel that they can add their own story to as well. And food is a great place where everyone's invested, right? Everyone's got a stake in food and can sense what the cultural issues are around it, which acts as a kind of entry level part to the argument about the bigger systems and processes that surround the food they consume.
Thank you, Anthony. Yeah, that was a very strong answer. And it's interesting, like, as you say, that there's such a connection between our school system, between our food systems and everything that's going on there, and the sort of climate change in systems there too. Jonathon, did you want to step in there?
I just wanted to actually agree very strongly with Anthony there, because this whole business about the politics of this is really important. And the truth of it is that we are very dependent on large numbers of people going over and above what they're required to do in particular contexts, whether it's as the head teacher in a school who's recognized that trying to raise the standards of the food that they can provide in school, whether it's in hospitals where you've got chronic problems with hospital food, actually meaning that sometimes people leave hospital less fundamentally healthy than they were when they went into hospital. And this is all really worrying because, of course, you have to change that system. And my sense of it is that we now understand that there are massive problems involved in outsourcing this whole notion about the provision of really good, nutritious food, which is good for people and for the planet, and outsourcing that to the private sector. And then two things happen. One, the Department for Education sets a ludicrous per person, per capita meal price, which then private sector procurers provide, but still have to make a profit on it. And we're beginning to understand fully now that if you outsource the provision of good, high quality food to people whose central ethos depends on making a profit over and above whatever else they deliver, we're going to end up in trouble. And school food at the moment is in trouble. There are huge numbers of totally unbelievably brilliant, devoted, dedicated teachers who make good food happen in their schools. But a hell of a lot of schools end up just doing what they have to do because the unit price is ridiculous. They don't have kitchens any longer. They've often had to cut back on the numbers of people who can work on the school food in schools, etc. So it's a systemic problem. And this dream that we all have of connecting kids with their food again, getting them excited about it, meeting vegetables, thinking it through from their perspective, all of that stuff, it means we're going to need some very, very serious changes in the way we think about school food. And you're right, Anthony. Marcus Rashford has been pointing out this whole pernicious side of food justice in that sense, but we've got to just change the norms which we think are appropriate in providing this critical part of young people's lives.
Yeah, it's a very good point, Jonathon. And I guess it leads on to my sort of next question, which is addressed to all of you really, which is sort of what is the ideal future of food, both in the UK, but also globally? And what role do young people and teachers play in actually making that a reality?
That is a very big question, Holly, which you just dumped on us, as it were. So, team, sort that one out, would you? If I may, just very quickly, because I did notice in the chat something that is very dear to my heart, which is we need to love food completely from start to finish, and just from the planting of the seed, as Jamal makes clear, you know, getting his tomato plants going on his balcony, all the way through to the ability to harvest that and then turn it into something that is wonderful and then share it as much as one can. And all of that is critical, but there is this lurking issue of food waste, and somebody on the call has asked about the food waste side of it, and that's critical. And I know Mike will talk a lot about this because food waste is a cruel part of the entire food system. We do waste a lot of food still. The calculation is something like 30%, or maybe even as much as 35% of everything grown never ends up in a human being's stomach. So it doesn't have any value to anybody whatsoever. And that's as true in some of the poorer countries where Mike and Fairtrade Foundation are working so hard. You have terrible problems with their supply chains, in particular, getting their carefully produced their product to market is often very difficult. And here in the UK, as you know, we have a lot of post-consumer food waste. The great thing is, if you can get kids thinking about that early on, then they become much less tolerant of what often goes on at home, where there's a lot of, I'm going to call it thoughtless. I don't mean to be too critical about that, but people just don't give enough thought to it. They don't see how they can make better use of the food that they've had lying around for a while. So food waste is a critical part of this, and any food system that is going to be fit for purpose in a more sustainable world will be a food system which has massively reduced the amount of food waste that we have today, but so many different means, different ideas, different opportunities to reduce food waste. But it's not the place where people normally start with this question, but it is an absolutely non-negotiable part of it.
Go ahead, Mike.
Yeah, let me just jump in on that, because Jonathan's making lots of really good points. I've been to banana farmers in Colombia, and they typically waste about 30% of their banana produce because it is unacceptable for the market. I don't know, the wrong shape, the wrong color, the wrong density, the wrong something or other. And I mean, they redistribute it locally or they try and recycle it. But I mean, it's a vast problem. So that's just one example. Jonathan's absolutely right. There's something sort of longer term here about our connection with food and farming. So somehow we have contrived to devalue it. And obviously there are all kinds of financial manifestations of that. So, you know, farmer poverty in the global north as well as the global south being just one example. But one of the things I think you're onto with Jamal's film is making it cool to know where your food comes from, making it something desirable and something that you'd want to be part of. And it's almost as if it's been a kind of corollary with the Industrial Revolution. You know, the further away you can get from farming, the more sophisticated you are. So you don't actually need to touch the mechanics of food production. That's really fundamentally wrong, and it's gone far too out of control. And it allows for the kind of private sector speculation that we've been talking about. And we all know that short-termism is a fundamentally difficult problem. You know, we need to invest in these long-term relationships with our food, long-term supply bases, so we can really invest in sustainability, because it doesn't come cheap, and you're not going to get a shareholder return inside a quarter. So I think it does start with reshaping the way we think about food and farming, and we need to find a way of making it attractive, not just so that there's a next generation of farmers, because we all know the average age of farming all over the world is, you know, more or less retirement age, which is terrible for us as consumers, but also because there's something so rich and so valuable in us as individuals connecting with the land. You know, one of the things that we've all heard during lockdown is, you know, people enjoying being outside, being in the environment where it's a little bit more peaceful because of the lack of kind of craziness of the modern world. There's something really important there for us to explore in terms of how do you make food and farming sufficiently attractive and aspirational for people to want to know about it, because we've lost that at the moment.
Yeah, great. Becky, what would you like to add to that?
I'll just jump in on that, Mike, because as Holly said in the introduction, I've been sort of entered the world of farming through where I live in Dorset, because I live in an estate that's got 1,000 acres, and we're sort of doing a big piece of work at the moment to imagine how we can farm it differently. And that involves long-term thinking, very long-term thinking. You know, a lot of the tree planting that we've got in mind, we won't see, you know, it probably won't be planted for 10 years, and we certainly won't see the maturity for many, many years to come. But that sort of journey has taken me to the Oxford Rural Farming Conference a couple of times, and actually this year it was online with over 5,000 people from all over the world. And I have to say, if you want to sort of have some inspiration about you know, farming being cool and an attractive career, there's some absolutely amazing inspirational young people that are so passionate and so clued up about how we can farm differently, and how that production of food not only gives us healthier food that's better for us, but also better for the environment and better for nature. And there's so many brilliant examples now of people that are growing in ways that really combat climate change, that combat all of our natural world destruction. But you know, the funding and the kind of the appreciation of that way of farming still isn't quite there yet. So I do think there's such an important role to play with organisations like Fairtrade and what we're trying to do with these films to kind of amplify those stories. And actually there's a huge issue as well in terms of entrance to farming, where there's a lot of passion of growers and people that want to get more involved, but they're finding it hard to find the opportunity. And also when they start going up the ladder from maybe working on small scale horticulture and they want to progress and they want to have their own area or their own farm, the land isn't available. You know, it's still in the hands of a very small amount of people, and a lot of them aren't open to change yet. So yeah, there's a lot of kind of systemic barriers, but I would say there's also a real groundswell of amazing creativity and goodwill, and some really brilliant young people that could be, you know, that teachers, you know, could find out more about in terms of people like the Soil Association are really championing some of those young people. Places like Riverford really shine a light on some of those cool young growers.
Yeah, that's such a good point. And it's interesting, you know, one of our attendees has just sort of asked a question in the chat saying, you know, what do we do about this sort of almost a conflicted question of whether we should eat locally produced food versus imported food, which might support growers in the global south, this idea of sort of trade, not aid. And it's interesting, you've kind of, both Mike and Becky there have kind of addressed that slightly in this idea of maybe if we inspire young people to get involved in farming, then actually they are just going to, in general, be more interested and more involved in knowing where their food is coming from, the food that they can't grow themselves. Would anyone like to sort of build on that and sort of think how we can address that question? Should we be looking more at local food, or is it really more about things like fair trade and making sure that we are trading, but we are doing it in a way that is sustainable and fair?
I can start off, shall I? Just
yeah,
quick, keen to hear other people's views as well. I mean, it's a really difficult one. Long term, logically, we need to be consuming more locally. I mean, that makes really good sense. There are certain things that we import and we depend on. So as I say, 15% of our food in the UK comes from the global south, so from low income countries, not just internationally. So we have a quite a complex relationship there. If we decided suddenly to stop that today, we would have a gap in our own food security that we would need to tackle, but we would also place enormous burdens of adaptation on extremely vulnerable, economically vulnerable groups overseas. So there's a responsibility there. I think that the solution is for us as consumers today, buy it locally where you can. If not, make sure it's fair. I mean, hopefully make sure it's fair however you buy it, but you know, so if you're going to be drinking tea or drinking coffee or eating a banana, make sure it's fairly produced, so you can at least be part of the solution. Because one of the things that we do in fair trade is help farmers adapt, so they diversify. So sugar farmers, for example, who have been involved in fair trade for years, are diversifying because of the extra working capital they get through fair trade, which helps them, because you know, long term there's not really going to be a future for sugar farmers from overseas. However, last point on this, they will say they are only sugar farmers because for hundreds of years the British expected them to grow sugar for their markets. So there is a sort of responsibility to kind of close that circle post-colonialism, to actually help farmers do something else rather than be dependent on us. We set these systems up, we have a responsibility for tackling them.
Yeah, that's a great point, Mike. Jonathan, do you want to build on that?
Sure, it is a difficult one, but we, in a funny kind of way, we just, as Mike said, we've just got to keep this in proportion. I can't bear the thought that we would think sustainability was all about doing everything locally, and if we couldn't do it locally, then you can't do it. As in, we're not going to trade with the rest of the world, and we're going to have to cut back on all of those things that we've come to love and cherish. And good that we're talking about bananas, for God's sake, because produce like bananas is such an important part of people's diets. And for me, this is really critical. So I get slightly nervous sometimes when we overdo the notion that localism trumps every other desirable aspect of a good, integrated, fair food system, as Mike put it. And I just want to make sure that we get the balance right. Having said that, then obviously going local is not only really good sense, but good fun. I mean, as Sophie and Becky know very well, I'm a sort of huge enthusiast for this thing called incredible edible local food production schemes, where local communities just get together and they decide, okay, we know we're not going to substitute for the big food retailers, but we're going to use our resources here in this town to help produce a good produce locally, which young people can get involved in and so on. These are completely compatible ideas. And there's absolutely no reason why we shouldn't have the best of both worlds, as long as we put some things right out there as preconditional, particularly the fairness side of it, that nobody's being exploited to make sure that we have a good, healthy, balanced, planet-friendly diet.
Becky, if you want to jump in, and then Anthony can follow.
I was just going to say, it kind of goes back to stories, I think, and as we, as Mike's organisation doing such a good job of, is sharing stories from our growers from around the world, so that we have an understanding and a relationship with who they are and what they're doing. And I think we have a responsibility for that with our local produce as well. I mean, I know where I live, there's a lady that grows veg that's not certified organic, but because we know her, we know that she doesn't spray, so she hasn't had to spend lots of money on that. She wouldn't have been able to afford to. She doesn't need to advertise it, that because we have that trust and relationship with her. She's very small scale. She doesn't make a lot of money, and I think it's, I think we all have a responsibility where we can, and that can equally be in urban environments too. There's some amazing growing projects in London, where again they wouldn't necessarily have all the sort of big branding and certification, but they are actually doing stuff on the ground. And if you take the time to even follow them on social media and understand who they are and what they're doing, then you can sort of start to understand, what their methods are and who the people are that are growing, and support the businesses which sort of chime with your own, your own values.
Yeah, it's a really good point. Anthony, I think you were going to say something after Becky, and then Sophie, you can follow.
Just quickly, I think in answer to the question, what fair trade versus localism, I think one of the ways to look at it is that every point in your supply chain should be equitable, right? So it means if the person who's selling you your meat is being paid a living wage, then most likely that you'll probably buy a little less meat, but the meat that you buy will be better appreciated. And similarly, all the way through that value chain, right up to the animal that's slaughtered on your behalf, if there's a kind of element of reciprocity and dignity in that chain, then you'll probably the animal will have a better life. But also there'll be less available. So a move from this kind of industrialization and division of labor to something where there's a kind of golden rule built into every exchange, even by the time it gets to your table, whereby there's a sense of, I think, gratitude for the food, where we've been geared over thousands of years towards scarcity of food, and now we're in a kind of position of superabundance. And I think some of those cultural values that we have need to be checked a little. I mean, the issue of localism is interesting because I saw that yesterday that some of the supermarkets have started to rebrand their Brussels sprouts as British sprouts. So the question of local affection is obviously quite an important one, but I think it's actually, there's a kind of social justice and also an animal welfare issue that's woven into that, that you have to attend to at every part of the supply chain.
Yeah, that's a very good point. And Sophie, did you have something that you wanted to add to that too before we wrap up?
Yeah, I mean, it's just a final point really, but I think it's what these conversations are about, which is about talking about it. And I don't think there's enough for young people, especially at school, for them to have the opportunity to talk about their food. And, we all eat, luckily, some of us eat 3 times a day, and there's an opportunity at every moment to talk about it. And that's where these stories are really important, because by talking about it, it just raises your awareness about where things come from, or what if we don't know what a squash is, maybe we should go and find out, and I think that's why these films are important, but that's why these whole panels are important, and just involving young people in the discussions earlier from, my toddler's age upwards is fundamental to knowing where the food is going to come from in the future.
That's a great point, Sophie, and also, a fantastic one to end on. As you say, it's all about story, it's all about conversation, and the more that we do connect and talk and talk about these things, then the more likely things are to change. I just want to thank all of our speakers today, and thank you to everyone as well who's tuned in. It's been great to have you here, and as I said before, I know it's been a difficult and intense week for so many teachers, so we really appreciate it. Do any of our panelists have any last thing that they wish that they had said that they haven't had a chance to say yet, or is everyone feeling like they've had their voices heard?
Can I just plug, Sophie, that we have more films coming and more events of this coming up soon. So a shameless plug on behalf of the creative team here, that there is more of this on the horizon. So do follow Reboot the Future for more events.
Absolutely, yeah. So Jamal's film, as well as the rest of the films, the teaching resources, and Jonathon's book Rise Up to Reboot the Future will be released on the 21st of April this year. So watch this space, and to sign up to be the first to receive them, you can visit www.globaldimension.org.uk/reboot the future. Jonathan, have you unmuted to say something, or?
Well, only those are excellent plugs. I just want to put in a quick last plug for Fairtrade Foundation for this session, and it's been a very interesting fortnight, and I haven't had a chance to talk to Mike about this, but last week I think you published this report about the degree to which we don't count the emissions of all the produce, fresh produce and manufactured produce, that is imported into this country. They aren't included in our emissions inventory. It's like they're off the balance sheet, as it were, completely. And it's a really important issue that has been raised by the Fairtrade Foundation here as part of this fortnight. So I just wanted to remind people that we can connect with these very big, sometimes slightly overwhelming international issues, as long as we can get that sort of clear insight into what it means to address them with that degree of compassion and concern.
Thank you, Jonathan, and yes, thank you, Holly, as well. It's about us joining up, right? So there is a really clear sense that the policymakers are lagging far too far behind, and there are lots of us who want to see this challenged and changed and done differently. So we just need to find ways of connecting, and certainly the point that you're doing here, you know, making positive, optimistic futures for people, so that the next generation really engages with this, because we will solve it if we do it together. And we mustn't let the policymakers backslide.
Absolutely. Brilliant. Thank you so much, Mike. Thank you too to Jonathan, Sophie, Becky and Anthony, and to the Fairtrade Foundation, and to everyone who joined us. I hope you all have a very lovely evening.
Thanks so much. My pleasure.
Thanks to you, Holly.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye.